America's biopharmaceutical companies have one very important thing in common.
A common enemy.
We're making great progress because we're collaborating in ways that we've never done before.
In a matter of weeks, we've progressed from potential treatments
to antibodies and antivirals that have shown positive results.
To several promising vaccine candidates.
Because science
is how we get back to normal.
Welcome to all the attendees of the 44th Annual Legislative Conference of the National Black Caucus of State Legislators. My name is Courtney Christian, and I am a Senior Director of Policy and Research at PhRma, the trade association which represents over 30 of the leading biopharmaceutical companies who are committed to finding treatments and cures that allow patients to live longer, healthier, and more productive lives. Since 2000, our member companies have invested nearly $1 trillion in the search for new treatments and cures, including an estimated $83 billion in 2019 alone. COVID-19 is having outsized impact in Black and Brown communities, highlighting gaps in equal access to quality healthcare, underscoring gaps in meaningful data collection, and gaps in longstanding health disparities. Its impact will likely be felt for some time. And historically, there have been stark disparities in reporting and representation of Black and Brown communities in clinical trials participation. That disparity is even starker for particular areas of study like cancer or asthma and allergies. The confluence of COVID-19 impacting communities of color and ongoing racial justice issues continuing to rise to the surface this year led our industry to a bold statement released in July, that systemic racism is as real as any disease and that our industry was not immune. We committed to racial justice principles that include committing to open, honest, real conversations about racial equity and what it means to have a culture of inclusion and belonging, investing in Black and Brown America and creating pathways to our industry for people from all backgrounds, dedicating efforts to improve health equity by actively advancing policy solutions and research that address the social determinants of health so that we can start to fix the health disparities that have existed throughout history and been laid bare by COVID-19, as well as addressing systemic challenges and skepticism that keep Black and Brown communities from participating in clinical trials because of historic wrongs. Clinical trials can give people access to potentially life-saving treatments and medicines and high-quality care. Enhancing diversity in clinical trial participation may lead to evidence that better reflects the patients most likely to use the medicines approved. At PhRma, we believe that diversity is essential to a robust innovation ecosystem that can deliver new medicines to everyone who needs them. Last week, PhRma released the first ever industry-wide principles on clinical trial diversity that seek to build trust within Black and Brown communities and eliminate systemic barriers to clinical trial participation. Addressing the long-held and deeply rooted skepticism in Black and Brown communities regarding the industry's clinical trial programs is fundamental to any effort to improve healthcare equity and build a system of biopharmaceutical innovation that best serves people of color. With potential vaccines for COVID-19 on the horizon, we are pleased to engage a distinguished panel with expertise from community-based organizations, academia, and policymaking for a discussion on COVID vaccine data, development process, and related clinical trials, and how the biopharmaceutical industry must bridge the gap in Black and Brown communities to address systemic issues that prevent enrollment in clinical trials. And now, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Frida Lewis Hall, who will moderate this discussion. During her 35-year career in medicine, Dr. Hall has been on the front lines of healthcare as a clinician, educator, researcher, and leader in the biopharmaceuticals and life science industries. She is an outspoken and ardent voice in healthcare, and I'm pleased to turn to her now to lead the discussion. So Dr. Hall, take it away.
Thank you so much, Courtney, and thank you for your opening remarks. They give us context for the conversation that we're about to have. And let me be sure to thank NBCSL for including us in their proceedings on such an important topic. And of course, last but not least, I have to thank this incredible panel that's been assembled to have this discussion with us today. So reminder, what we're going to discuss is two topics, really. The first is COVID-19 vaccines, and the second is clinical trials. We want to talk about those in a couple of contexts. We want to think about safety, we want to think about efficacy, and we want to think about trust. Of course, COVID vaccines has a very urgent place in our conversation. We want to talk about clinical trials as well, as they relate to COVID vaccines and therapies, but also as they relate to the health disparities that have burdened our community for so many years. In order to help us with that conversation, I have three amazing panelists. The first is Dr. Reed Tuckson. He's the former Commissioner of Health for Washington, D.C., and has created a community-based coalition to fight COVID in Washington, D.C. He's coordinated a major initiative involving Black health leadership, speaking directly to the Black community. Next, Dr. Jennifer Irves, Assistant Professor at Meharry Medical College in the Department of Internal Medicine. Dr. Irves is a public health oncologist who is focused on cancer prevention behaviors and lowering cancer disparities and inequities using community engagement. And last but absolutely not least, the Honorable Bruce Antone. He is the immediate past chairman of the 29-member Florida Legislative Black Caucus. Well, welcome to each of you. I'm going to start, I guess, first question, Dr. Tuckson, and that is you're creating this coalition and pulling together Black professionals in the DC area. Talk to me a little bit about what you've done and what you've learned.
Thank you so much, and great to be with all of you. One of the things that we learned, and I was lucky enough to be the health commissioner during the height of the AIDS epidemic, is absolutely how important it is for community-based organizations to partner with government if we're going to fight these sort of major health challenges. And so we have been so grateful to be able to reach into our faith community, our labor community, musicians, artists, poets, you name it, returning incarcerated citizen advocates, homeless advocates, just across the board. We've been so lucky to engage the influencers, the people who determine and set the tone and culture of our community, and mobilizing them to transmit the information about COVID and its prevention to their constituency. It comes so much better when it comes of and from the community. The other thing, Dr. Lewis Hall, that we've been able to do is in a landmark effort, we have now brought together the 4 historically Black medical schools, Howard, Meharry, Morehouse, and Charles Drew, plus the National Medical Association, the Cobb Institute of the National Medical Association, the National Black Nurses Association, the National Urban League, and blackdoctor.org, all of these coming together now to form a coalition that has been producing town halls and other messages across our nation. So I'll conclude by saying that what we have learned is that there is this moment where there is so much, as you indicated in your introduction, distrust. And when there is so much misinformation that is sent to our community, the organized leadership of Black healthcare in America is now saying to the Black community, we are going to be a trusted and energetic voice in having a conversation with you based on our historical and contemporary expertise and our commitment to saving the lives of Black people. And maybe we'll talk more about it as we go on.
I think trust is going to be a theme in our conversation over the course of our time together. And somebody who knows a little bit about trust and is about to give us some insights, I am sure. Jennifer, talk to me a little bit about your current research and in particular, how you've engaged the community, and talk about why that is so important.
Okay, so good morning. So yes, so I've been working to increase HPV vaccination among African Americans. Specifically, I started with African American mothers for daughters, and when we quickly realized this was not just a woman's issue and African American women weren't disproportionately affected only, we needed to address our men too. So we had some HPV associated cancer disparities when it came to our African American men. And so over the years, I have worked by engaging the community to actually identify what factors are influencing HPV vaccine uptake, as well as what strategies are needed that are culturally targeted to our Black and Brown communities. What's so important about community engagement is that when we incorporate the community, they have a voice. meaning a lot of times we think we know what's best for the community from the outside looking in. But it's when we actually sit at the table and let their voice be heard, not just on the individual, but who are those people they interact with, what organizations are working with them, the community factors. All of those things are influencing, whether they uptake or engage a behavior. And that has been so important. So now that has transcended for me in my research. Now I'm looking at hesitancy as it relates to HPV vaccination and identifying proper strategies to address those needs. And so over the summer, that quickly translated into looking at COVID vaccine research with some colleagues at Meharry to understand what are people's views towards this vaccine and some of the hesitant factors. And we're very much seeing a similar correlation in those factors and the misinformation, along with other things that we're going to have to address. So overall, engaging the community should be at the forefront when we are addressing health disparities and health inequities.
And Bruce, you've been engaged in the community for a very long time as a leader and change agent. Can you talk about some of your experiences and maybe some of the questions that you get around the COVID vaccine and clinical trials in your travels through the community?
Yes, so very much over the past, I would say 4 months, we did some interviews within the African American community to kind of gauge, were they prepared for the pandemic, the stressors, do they understand the importance of preventive behavior? And then we got to the vaccine. We talked about research and the trials, would they participate? And of course, very much the same thing. I do not want to be a guinea pig. I think this was the common theme that came up in these interviews. And they commonly mention, like, I need other people to go first. Specifically, some would even say, I think the white people should go first and then let it come to us. Let's see how it works with them. And it's like, but we got to really educate on why this is important. We got to address that, this vaccine is not going to give them COVID. We need to talk about some of the immediate effects from getting the vaccine. What have we seen with people? We need to educate them about that. What does the clinical trial process look like? They don't understand, how it went from this long 7 to 10 year process to now we can do this in just a matter of months. How did that happen? So in order to, I guess, address some of their concerns, we need to engage people to educate around this fact around COVID research, how we got the vaccine, where we're going, some of the results. And we may start seeing some change in behaviors because I think overall we realize it's important. They realize it's important. It's the fear factor. And we hear about the common things of, the Tuskegee study, that happened. So is this the same case? Why are you pushing us to go first? But they don't understand, like, there's a disparity there and we're trying to help the community. So it's some things we're going to have to address education wise, if we're going to see some change in attitudes towards this COVID vaccine.
I want to ask Bruce, just to add in from his perspective as a legislator and leader in the community, his perspective, kind of what are we hearing? Is it similar? Is it different? Where is your exclamation point on what's being said in the community?
Well, good morning. And again, thanks to you and thanks to NBCSL for allowing me to be on this panel. I mean, I'm hearing the same thing. There's a lot of bad information out there, a lot of misinformation. I mean, we've got folks talking about Bill Gates wants to test the vaccine on African Americans or Africans first, and this is a way for them to inject nanotechnology into folks. But I mean, we've got some real issues that we need to deal with in terms of convincing our community to participate in the vaccine program, as well as the clinical trials. I mean, I see this as an opportunity for us to jumpstart better healthcare in the African American community. We really need to convince our people, and I'm sorry I'm saying our people, but convince people in the community that they need to work on improving their health. So I'm hearing the same things.
So you went through the vaccine development process. Do we want to pause? I'm getting an echo. So Rita, I said I wanted to come back to you to see if we can get a little bit of a framework of, as Jennifer asked the question that she gets asked, how y'all doing this in 10 months if it usually takes you 10 years? And what does the process look like for developing a vaccine?
So we really want to be very clear that this process has not been irresponsible in any way. And that the conclusion of what I will say is that you can have confidence in the process. First and foremost, what happens here is that the fundamentals of the science-based infrastructure to develop the precursors of our knowledge for which translates into a vaccine has been sped up because of the investments that we as a nation have made, particularly during the Obama administration, where we now have great new technology so that the things that we are using now, this special mRNA technology, which is novel and new and exciting, is something that had been waiting for applicability and use now for several years. So we didn't start from a standing start, but there was already a running start. And I think it's important to realize that as legislators, when we are funding our science infrastructure at the NIH and other places, this is what happens when you now have that kind of innovation standing there. And good tribute to the Obama administration for what they did to help us there. Number two, when we are doing the process of clinical trials, there are various stages, 3 major stages. Usually we have taken the posture of using those in sequence. We're now running many of those stages simultaneously, still observing carefully the early stages, even as later stages go forward. So we've truncated the process without sacrificing safety. So I think those are the really key points here. And then finally, of course, our biomedical companies are moving so rapidly to devote all of their resources to commiserate at the level of a national pandemic of this nature. So it's all hands on deck. Finally, I would say, Dr. Frida Little-Saul, that I am particularly attentive to the process of review. You have used the word several times, and it's important. When we have a safe and effective vaccine, there is no shortcut on the safety side. First of all, the pharmaceutical companies that are developing these have their own moral responsibility and their own checks and balances. You used to have the job at one of those companies where you were signing off on the credibility of that before it even got to the FDA. But what I will make as my last point here is I was very pleased by the FDA, and particularly the man who has to sign ultimately off on this vaccine safety and efficacy. His name is Peter Marks. And when the President of the United States was saying that he was demanding that there would be a vaccine approved by Election Day, he was the one who said, under no circumstances am I going to be passing judgment or even coming to my committee for review until there have been at least 2 months of data from these companies going forward. And he held to that position, and that is the position that we have today. So we are moving fast, but not so fast that we're being irresponsible. This is a time where we need all hands on deck. It's been done properly, and we can have confidence in the results as they move forward.
And Jennifer, and thank you, Reed, for that, because this is a long and complex process that you explained beautifully in, kind of in the context that everyone can see that it is a robust process. But Jennifer, you're on the front lines, and does explaining that help? And if so, how and from whom?
I would say that explaining it does help. So I'm going to give an example. So starting in 2018, 2017, we went through this long process, but we actually did a pilot study where we had developed some educational materials to educate African-American and Latino communities about cancer clinical trials. And in that educational piece, we actually went through talking about cancer, what is it, how it affects the body. And then we had a slide talking about clinical trials. We tried to explain from, like Dr. Tuckson said, this is phase 1 all the way up to phase 4. This is what happens. This is what you can expect. And we also talked about biospecimen donation because we know that we want them to give tissue, want them to give samples, you know, when we want to study health issues. And we tried to educate about that, address the Tuskegee study, what happened, and then we brought them to date, like this is what the Institutional Review Board is for. We have HIPAA in place. And then we tried to link them to sources if they end up wanting to participate. And out of that work, what we found was that it did increase, that study did increase knowledge, it did increase trust in medical researchers. And for the African American community specifically, it increased willingness, but we didn't see a significant increase in willingness among Latinos. But overall, what we found is that this might be one first step, because of course we know there are many barriers to clinical trial participation. Education is just one, but this is the start, I think, by engaging the community, allowing people of the community to provide this education, because we use community health educators that look like them, and they provided this intervention to them. And I think this is the first step. So we can probably translate some of that, needless to say, with the COVID vaccine and doing some educational outreach, doing just what Dr. Tuckson just said, because there are concerns and the communication has not been that great around this vaccine to our communities. And we got to get in the trenches if we want those that are most affected to actually benefit from this vaccine.
And Dr. Lewis Hall, if I could just augment, because I'm so glad that Jennifer brought up this issue of Tuskegee, and let me be also, in terms of the comments I made just a moment ago, let me extend those comments to the following. I, just as every single person on this telecast is upset and would be upset about what happened in 1930 and 1940 and 1950 with the Tuskegee syphilis study. But this is 2020. This is not the same place. Let's remember that after, and I think, Jennifer, you made a very good point, is that after the Tuskegee experiment was discovered and its horrificness was exposed, there were new rules put in. It was something called the Belmont Vision. Doesn't matter the name, but it was a national effort that said, we are going to have in place now a whole new infrastructure that monitors how health research is done. And she mentioned these IRBs, these institutional review boards. Be clear, every one of us, that on these IRBs, these review boards all across the country, every single clinical trial that we have has to have those. And we have people of color on those. Let's also remind ourselves that what is not the same as 1930 in 2020 is at the head of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute at the NIH is an African-American researcher. Let's remind ourselves that the person who is developing and leading the team to develop the basic science for a COVID vaccine is an African-American woman who is doing that work, who is the star of Tony Fauci's lab. Let's remind ourselves that on the FDA committee that is going to be transparently reviewing the data from the clinical trials from all of the companies that are going to be submitting their application for approval for these vaccines. On that transparent public committee is the president of Meharry Medical College, a Black man. And so I want to just continue to emphasize that, yes, we should be outraged at 1930. But we cannot be continuing to live in the past. As one of my community activists, when we had the kind of meeting that Jennifer talks about, we had the meeting and a stalwart, hardcore community activist said, you know, baby, if we keep living in the past, we're gonna die in the future. It is time now to move forward and stop making excuses that hamstring our Black health professionals from having the innovation and the tools and the knowledge to save our lives and close these disparities. You cannot close your disparities if you're looking back and living your life in 1930.
And Bruce, I see you nodding, and Reed talked a lot about how we have a framework, how we have policies in place, how we have community leadership. Can you talk about at the state level what we might want to be thinking about in both advancing the vaccine and also clinical trial participation?
All right, so let me start by saying that I think it's important that every minority legislative caucus, whether it's the Black caucus, Hispanic caucus, Asian caucus, Native American caucus, that they demand that they play an active role in the vaccine rollout and that they play a role in increasing participation in clinical trials. I mean, it's just extremely important. And so every caucus, and in this case, we're talking to NBCSL, every Black caucus needs to identify and appoint one person in their caucus to be the lead person that leads the effort on the vaccine rollout and participation in the clinical trials. And so that person has to be knowledgeable about clinical trials. That person has to have the desire to be the point person. Then that person has to be committed. They have to commit the time to do it. From there, they need to reach out to the governor or the lieutenant governor and again, demand that they play an active role in the vaccine rollout and that they start to put more emphasis on minority health. Because again, COVID-19 just brings to light that we've got a lot of health issues in the African-American community. And so again, this is an opportunity for us that say every Black caucus needs to focus on encouraging better health outcomes in our community. And so they need to meet with the governor. They need to meet with the Department of Health. They need to seek an appropriation for funds to fund an outreach program, kind of like what Jennifer talked about with the cancer thing. I mean, we've got to do this. We've got to move forward. And like Dr. Reed said, we can't live in the past. So we've got to move forward. I mean, this is 2020. This is 1930, 1940, 1950. So we've got to move forward. And then lastly, let me just say this. It's important that every Black caucus reach out to their pharmaceutical reps, okay, for that state, especially Pfizer, especially AstraZeneca, and request a briefing on the COVID-19 vaccine and the clinical trial. They need to get up to speed. When I say they, the Black legislators need to get up to speed on what is coming forward. And so I'll just stop there. And I hope that answered your question.
Absolutely, and very provocative. I had a follow-up question that you mentioned the pharmaceutical industry and doing the education for state legislators. What else could the pharmaceutical industry do to help encourage, one, kind of better education around the COVID vaccine? And then also, what might the industry do to improve its platform, the understanding of and the participation in clinical trials?
And so what the pharmaceutical companies could do is form a partnership with these various Black caucuses across the state, across the United States. And again, they could provide funding. They could reach out to the governors or the lieutenant governors in those states and say, hey, let's form this partnership with this minority caucus. So it's the governor, it's the Black caucus, it's the pharmaceutical companies. But again, participation in these clinical trials is extremely low. And so if we want to move forward, if we really want to get better research data on these vaccines and drugs for cancer, diabetes, heart disease, we've got to do something different. And so again, this is that opportunity for the pharmaceutical company to use additional resources, to use additional people, to increase participation. And so through your Black legislators, they can then reach down to their local elected officials. They can reach down to the various patient advocacy groups in certain communities, breast cancer groups, diabetes groups, asthma groups. But I mean, there's so much potential here. There's so much opportunity here for us to do something different and to significantly increase minority participation in the clinical trials. And then again, we really have to dispel this bad and misinformation on this COVID-19 vaccine. So I hope that answers your question.
If I could also just augment Bruce's excellent points, I would add the following. First, I think the context is that the private sector pharmaceutical industry, I think, are committed to doing the right thing. And I think that this program and what they're doing shows a good heart. And so let's build upon this foundation. Let's remember that There are billions of dollars that are being spent on the development and dissemination of these vaccines, but very little is actually going, when you really look at the proportion, to getting a needle in an arm, particularly of our community. There really does need to be more. And too often in our history, and I'm not saying this for this particular moment perhaps, but in our history, the Black community, Black legislators and Black community-based organizations have been asked, because it's your mission to continue to do stuff on the cheap. We're supposed to make a way out of no way. Well, you know, doggone it, we get tired of that. And so let's be sure that the money flows and the balance is sort of struck, because it makes no sense to spend billions developing a vaccine that doesn't go in people's arms. So let's get the balance right. And there's still an opportunity to do that. And secondly, when I went through that list of the people who are in positions of authority in government and in these IRBs, let's make sure that there are some people we can point to inside of these companies, like a Frida Lewis Hall, who was formerly doing that work. But you see, the only way to get this trust back is that we've got to see the private sector pharmaceutical industry, the private sector medical, every part of the health system has got to now start bringing in people of color in positions of decision and authority, so that when we do go to our community, we can highlight these people and say, this is not just somebody who has a make work job. This is a decision maker who has the juice and the authority to be able to protect not only Black life, but all life. And so I think these are two critical things that we need to do more of.
And just to further add to that, in working in the community, I can say there is a distrust in the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry are viewed as what you call drug pushers, and it's about getting the drug out there and not, you know, for the best benefit of the good, including African American and Latino populations. I mentioned those because those are the populations I have mostly worked with. And so with that being said, and thinking about strategies to add to that, you know, if money is going into the vaccine, we do need to put some money into outreach. They need to see the pharmaceutical industry face when it's not a pandemic. If you can come out and educate about what that process looks like at the pharmaceutical industry, start educating so the comfort can get there and the trust can build, like, okay, they do have my best interests. Like you just said, you know, the industry came out with this huge clinical and diversity initiative. They need to hear that, you know, they need to know that you're there and you care and you recognize there is a need. So with that being said, just to add to all of that, it's time to start establishing a face in the community so people can know who you are, what you stand for, what you have done, and where you intend to go. And once you do that, you will start opening the door for people to be more receptive when things like a COVID-19 vaccine comes into play.
Thank you for sharing that. I just have to share one quick story, I guess. When I first came into the industry back in the 90s, my colleagues thought it was a terrible thing, and my family cried real tears. You know, oh, all this work to become a doctor and you throw it all away to go work in the pharmaceutical industry. But my husband knew my heart and said, you've been a healer since I've known you. Doesn't matter if you do it one at a time or a million at a time. And I just felt that that was compelling. But I was troubled and went to my aunt and asked her, you know, how can we be doing such good work and be so distrusted? What do we need to do to earn trust? And she said, simply be trustworthy. And so what I'm hearing you say is to continue our commitment, partnering in the community and continuing to work shoulder to shoulder, side by side, to get this very hard work of getting a vaccine to save lives and also to save lives around health disparities. So exactly. That is extremely helpful.
And your point, Frida, along with Jennifer's point, I had the privilege in the latest issue of the journal Science, which is a major publication for the research world. I was able to write an editorial, and I was asked to write an editorial. And my comment was this, is that one of the disease of distrust is about as bad as the diseases that we're trying to deal with. And that what is irritating, and quite frankly, I'm outraged by, is that how is it possible that when we were fighting the HIV epidemic in the 80s, that the issue of Tuskegee was all over the place and was the rate limiting step for trying to get people to do the right thing. How in the heck could it be that in 2020, Tuskegee is the rate limiting step for trying to get something done? What has the pharmaceutical industry done? What has the research enterprise done? What has the AMA done? What has, if you go to every sector of healthcare, we've done nothing to address this issue in all of those years. 40 years, we've done nothing. And so my point being, this is the time. So I want to extend my comment and your observation, Frida. It's not just the pharmaceutical industry. It's every researcher. It's every doctor or nurse who has a relationship individually with a patient. We have all got to decide together that we're going to stamp this doggone thing out, because the next pandemic, which is on its way, which is inevitable, we cannot keep fighting the same fight over. Let's stop this. So when Black people stand up and say Black Lives Matter, the health enterprise across the board, they cannot continue to sit on their hands and just watch. If people feel so strongly that their lives have to be attested to being of value, then that affects everything. And the health people need to be standing right beside our community and showing by thought, word, and deed that they are with us, so that we can, for once and for all, bury this distrust.
So we've raised trust over and over. Let's go back and talk about, some of the very specific things that we might be able to do that maybe are scalable from your experiences in your community or in the therapeutic area that you work in or in the state that you represent. Jennifer, can you kind of start us off on some of the things that you've seen around HPV and with cancer prevention and early diagnosis and treatment that might be scalable to other therapeutic areas?
I think the first thing, so simple, so easy, transparency, honesty. Many times, we feel like, well, if I say all of that, how is that going to make the community feel if they know this aspect of the vaccine? Or I don't want to tell them something went bad because then they won't get it. But the reality of it is they want to know that stuff. They want to hear, like, well, we had this side effect happen here. Now, the chances of it happening here are slim to none, but we want you to know to make an informed decision. A lot of times the community don't feel like they have enough information to make an informed decision. So instead of doing the right thing and researching, they go find all this misinformation when we could have just told them up front, this is what it is because of your history. And that's where that patient-centered approach comes in, being able to understand their medical history. Because of your medical history, slim to none, or this may happen based off of someone else. But going in, I think this is the better thing for you to do, which is to get the vaccine. And so when we start educating from that perspective, being honest, transparent, so from the community point, just being honest about what COVID is, the vaccine, and then when they get to the doctor, okay, this is your history, this is what I think you should do, and you have built that trustworthy relationship, you'll have better outcomes with the community, as long as everyone said, we address all the other inequities to make this available to them, we'll have better outcomes. So I would say the first thing and most important thing is trust and transparency. That's all we have to go by is our word. And that's what's so important to the community.
And Bruce, what do you think about, it's something that maybe that you've seen in your work either in Florida or through the NBCSL that you think might be scalable?
One is just getting more information out in the community. Again, that community engagement, that community education piece, and it's not just the COVID-19 vaccine or the COVID-19 clinical trials, it's all of the clinical trials. Another part is putting a renewed emphasis on eliminating health disparities. I mean, when folks go to the doctor, they really need to know what questions to ask. They need to demand that they sit in there long enough to truly understand their health. And then thirdly, and this is something that I push all the time, is everybody needs to focus on their personal health. I mean, we really got to push folks to focus on their personal health, because if they lose the weight that they need to lose, if they take their meds as they should, if they get the proper exercise, if they make sure that their mind, their body, and their spirit is whole and it's fixed, then that makes them less susceptible to COVID-19, to cancer, to diabetes, or what have you. But again, they've got to get themselves together, and that will make them less susceptible to other diseases that are impacting our community.
And I would add to Bruce and Jennifer's excellent comments that let's remember that the thing that's most scalable is changing the culture by having authoritative people speaking who have integrity. Our political leaders got elected. These are people that know their community, and our community trusts them. They need to be the ones carrying the message and translating the message into the language of the people. And it is their advocacy. Remember now that the public health community is under threat all over the country. People are hollering and screaming at public health people, making them look like they are bad guys and nefarious actors. If this is the moment where our elected officials have got to stand shoulder to shoulder, bring that public health official right in front of them, put your arm around them and say, let's talk to our community. So let's make sure that we are using the voices of integrity and then bringing forward who's the campaign manager for your campaign that got you elected. That person, him or her, that's the public health deputy we now need to have. Bring a whole nother level of health deputies into this. The last point may sound a little more abstract, but I think it's important, and that's this. We have got to fight for better science and math education in these schools. Our people cannot make sense of all of this information because we don't have the science literacy to understand an mRNA vaccine. What is a vaccine? How does it work? What's this new technology? These are the tools of living in the modern world. It is so frustrating that we don't have access to that kind of education. And so we've got to look to the long run also on that point, especially, by the way, when we live in a genetic era where almost all of medicine is going to be based on genetics. We've got to ramp up our scientific literacy.
And one thing to add to that I forgot to mention is the importance of our researchers, healthcare providers, anybody in the community engaging our populations, is to make sure they're culturally competent, that they can recognize when our community don't understand or there's a health literacy issue, so that they'll know how to actually engage the community to make sure they understand what's going on, what's at stake if you don't get this vaccine, and be able to relay it in a way that it relates to the culture, their everyday norm. Because if it doesn't resonate with them and why it's important, or you can't reach them, I mean, the vaccine uptake is going to be poor. And we already see, based off, like you said, some of the polls, they said they're not going to get the vaccine because it doesn't resonate yet. So we got to do a better job of making sure we're culturally competent to reach those who are most at risk.
And let me just add real quick is that we've really got to do a good job of educating our legislators. I mean, I've been focused on minority health disparities for the past 20 years, but I think I'm an exception. And I would just say to other folks in my caucus, I'm not so sure they're aware of what this is all about. I mean, they can go out and advocate for COVID-19 testing and stuff like that. But when we start to talk about this vaccine and the distrust and the misinformation out there and why we need to do clinical trials, I don't think they are equipped to talk about that. So we really need to focus on educating our legislators. And so then they can be those ambassadors that Dr. Tuckson talked about. They can get out there. They have the trust of the community, and then they can begin to convince the community that they have to participate, and they can begin to help dispel that bad and misinformation that's just overwhelming our community. I'm done.
You mentioned, everyone mentioned ambassadors in some form or function. Is there someone else? So we've thought about legislators, we thought about healthcare professionals, patients, their families. Are we missing any group of people that we should tap as ambassadors?
I think there are a lot of people who are important. This is a multi-team effort, and everybody's got a role. But I would certainly single out, of course, our faith leaders. I mean, this is so key, and we know that, and we draw upon our faith community an awful lot. But the one I want to get into are our young musicians. It's the rap kids. It's the kids who have the voice of other kids. In DC, one of the first things we did when we created our coalition was to get the leading go-go musician. That's the music of DC. It's hip music, by the way, if y'all ain't in the go-go. But we took our leading go-go musician, called up the bus system and the metro system and said, we want to put his face on the buses and in the metro section with his wearing a mask. And they immediately leaped to it. And so we got that young man's face posted all over the city, and he's wearing his mask and he's looking out at the audience and he's saying, I'm wearing my mask. What about you? These are the kinds of people we also need. You cannot turn away anyone who has the ear of our community. And let's really pay attention to our young people who are the ones who really are the hardest to reach right now.
Let me add our radio personalities in the African-American community, whether it's the gospel station, whether it's WHER, but every radio station has a radio personality. There's some DJ that we can work with. I mean, we have a lady here that focuses big on asthma, but we can get her engaged. We can get the people on the gospel stations engaged, but those can be ambassadors as well. And they're on the radio just about every day. So we need to take advantage of that.
And Jennifer, do you have any, kind of not hidden, but people that maybe you wouldn't think of automatically in this space?
One thing that has commonly come up in my work that I had overlooked was the elderly population or the mama of the church. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? They said, this is the one who we listen to, has that advice, that encouragement, telling me not to do this or you need to do this. It said they're the mouthpiece that comes down from generations. It can tell mama, grandchildren, great-grandchildren what you can't do. So I will say, especially in the African-American and Latino community, especially those multi-generational homes, the mom, the grandma, the grandpa, especially the mom though, the grandma, she has that, that influence over her family and what needs to be done. So I think that's one untapped area that we've kind of overlooked, is the closeness of the family, and we need to target some of the individuals in the home.
If I had an extra hand, I'd give her 3 thumbs up, but I can only get 2 now, so I'm gonna give
So I had to just tell you really quickly. So I had my little white coat. I was a doctor and everything, and I was giving out advice. And one day my cousin looked at me and said, well, I'm gonna ask Granny. I was like, I just went to medical school. I did all this training. You gonna ask Granny? She was like, because that's who I go to. So that is a wonderful catch. Thank you.
Can I ask one question? Are we doing everything we can to get our Hispanic serving institutions and our historically Black institutions involved in this education, in this engagement, in this outreach? I mean, they all do wonderful research. I mean, they all write wonderful grants, but are they actually disseminating that information? And so can we get them more involved in what we're trying to do here as we move forward?
I really appreciate that. I can't speak to the Hispanic community, but I can certainly speak to the African American. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we really do now have these 4 Black medical schools, the NMA, the National Black Nurses. We've been conducting national town halls. We did 2 of them so far in the last month. We got more than 250,000 Black people online listening to these messages. We just briefed 10,000 health professionals, giving them the information. And we just finished on Friday briefing the Black press. We had a whole hour with Black press giving them the information. So what I would say, Bruce, is I love your point, and let me say to the to the organization now that we stand ready, and hopefully this conversation will lead to a conversation with me representing all of those institutions, and let's partner and stitch those together along with our caucus of Black states legislators and the brain trust, organized brain trust of the Black health leadership. We are standing there ready to hug you safely with masks. We're ready to stand there and hug you and get some work done. So Bruce, I'm glad you introduced it. and it's already created. All we need to do now is a phone call and a meeting.
And to comment on that from the research world, I think this is one area that we're recognizing now that's so important. And I think for those who are already in community research, community participatory, community engaged research, we already knew it was important to disseminate the work back to the community. But of course, it wasn't a requirement by grant agencies. Like, you need to make sure once you do this research, you give it back to the community. And ultimately, that has created the distrust in the community, or one of the reasons, because you took my data, you took my sample, but you didn't come back and tell me what happened behind that. What were the next steps? What did you do with it? And so now I think for you to mention that is so important. I lead the dissemination core at Meharry, and one of the things is we're working on now to identify the best strategies to get this information back out to the community, whether it's the COVID vaccine trial. We're trying to work with the researchers to actually do that. So we do understand the importance. We've taken on an initiative. We created this core to actually engage in this and make it happen. So yes, we understand the importance, and we're working to do the best we can to address this issue that hasn't been commonly done in research.
Well, we have shared so much information and inspiration. We could do this all day long, or at least I could listen to you all day long. But I want to wrap up with each of you giving kind of a lightning round summary of what you think is most important to remember, and then a to-do.
Great.
Reed, why don't we start with you, Reed?
What's most important to remember first and foremost is there are an awful lot of people of color that are going to die, and they're going to die soon because of this pandemic. This holiday season, this winter season, this is going to be a season of despair. And I think we need to be very sober about it, and we need to be absolutely energized. There is nothing on our plates that is more important than working with our community to fight this thing and to try to protect. So please, during the holiday season, let's be sure we do not have our folks doing things that will get them or their families killed. So I just have to really put that there. And secondly, I think that what we need is we need to leverage and partner our activities. We need to get our work done at scale. Let's stop all this little singles and bunts. We need to hit home runs. And so please, everybody, let's coordinate and leverage our assets and our resources. Even if we don't have a lot of assets, we have assets, and we can put those together, structure those with and execute with competence so that we will be able to fight the level of fight that we have to fight this horrible virus. Excuse me.
Jennifer?
Yes, I would have to say, I think along with the structural and social disparities that we have, is that we need to do a better job of communicating with our communities. We need to make sure we understand what their needs are as we're going through this pandemic, so that we can adequately give the resources that they need to fight this pandemic, but not only that, to build the trust so that when times like these come again, we will have a better chance of engaging them and actually getting an answer sooner than what we're doing now. Because right now we're gonna have to fight through some layers of distrust, some issues of the inequities, and all these things. We're going to have to deal with that as we move forward with COVID-19. So with that being said, let's use this as a time to lay a framework of engaging them in this process so that we can have better results as we move forward with COVID-19 and other issues to come.
And I would just say, from a legislative standpoint, Black legislators need to step into the gap. They need to step up. They need to step forward. They need to demand that they are actively involved in minority health decisions, minority health legislation that passes from here today moving forward. And so with this COVID-19 vaccine, with the clinical trials, Black legislators need to step up and make sure that they are playing an active role, using their influence, their power, to make sure that the communities they represent have an opportunity to take the vaccine if they so decide to do so. and that they encourage people to get involved in the clinical trials. And then lastly, I would just say, we need to encourage everybody to have a health improvement plan. Because again, we can take the vaccine, we can participate in the clinical trial, but if everybody's not doing as much as they can to make sure that they are healthy, they will always be susceptible to COVID-19, to the flu, to the cold, or what have you. But this is an opportunity for us, and we need to build upon it. I wish we had more time today to really delve into this, but man, I think this is a great start. This is a great panel, man. I'm just privileged, honored to be a part of this panel discussion.
You took the words right out of my mouth. This has just been incredibly energizing and inspiring and informative all at the same time. And I'm so glad that we've given ideas and opportunities at the individual level and small coalitions, and to turbocharge all hands on deck to meta collaborations to really address this and to do so with great urgency. And I want to, again, thank each of you for spending your time with us, to NBCSL for allowing us to be a part of their very important gathering, and to PhRma for starting us off with Courtney's great comments, and also all of the efforts that the industry is supporting. Courtney mentioned that there was a significant commitment by PhRma in the form of kind of an announcement and now work and follow through. We want to make sure that you know that that isn't just lip service, and that work is happening and advancements are being made. And if you want to keep up with that progress, please go to pharma.org/equity. Again, thanks to everybody for spending this time with us today.